Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. Today, we're not going to Russia, we're not going to Ukraine, but we're going to the next best thing. We're going to talk to a former ambassador to Russia and who is of Ukrainian background, somebody who was also a Canadian ambassador to Poland and Belarus and Uzbekistan and Armenia. So he knows that region pretty damn well. And it's a real pleasure to get back in touch with Ralph Lisichin. Ralph, I figured more than 35 years ago, and we've been trying to get caught up in the last few minutes, but there's just a lot of ground to cover. Good morning, Ralph. How are you?
Good morning. I am fine.
Good. You're in Ottawa or where?
I'm in Ottawa.
That's where you live now, I guess. Now, retired diplomat, it says. Isn't that
That's right.
I knew you before you were His Excellency.
I'm not anymore either.
Well, let's talk about the water under the bridge that has flowed all these years, and particularly that is not flowing too well between Russia and Ukraine these days. I know that your own heritage was Ukrainian. You were from Saskatchewan. And but you say you only speak 6-year-old Ukrainian, which I find hard to believe. Okay, so we have already gotten into talking about the origin of the present tensions, and I think right away we both have similar interpretations of at least the whole thing about nationalism. Would you repeat the story you began to tell me about having met somebody and who warned you what to expect when you became ambassador?
I would happily. From my perspective, and I've been thinking a lot about this, is that clearly in our relations with Russia and in our attempts to manage them, we severely underestimated the degree that Russian nationalism plays in the conflict with Ukraine, but also in its relations with the West generally. And this has probably been always the case. One of my first bosses, when I first joined Foreign Affairs and was working on Soviet affairs, told me that this wasn't just between communism and capitalism, but that we had to always take into account Russian nationalism. Russian nationalism was a bit of a two-edged sword or a two-edged thing through most of the communist period. Communist ideology did not accept nationalism. This was to be international, it was to be brotherhood, and that was the official line. On the other hand, I think the Russian leadership recognized that it was nationalism and patriotism that led to the defeat of Hitler, not love of communism. And so that nationalism was, to some degree, very important. There is a very interesting book called Black Wind, White Snow, The Rise of Russia's New Nationalism by a journalist called Charles Clover. And it's not a novel, it's a well-researched book, came out in 2017, in which he traces sort of the roots of extreme Russian nationalism from the 1920s through the communist period, when a lot of the strongest advocates of Russian nationalism had to be in exile. They weren't acceptable to the communists. What he also pointed out, and I think is very important, is that when communism ended in 1990, a lot of these people came back. And where they came back to teaching jobs, many of them in the military academy and in the academies of the security services. And when the communists were making their deals with the nationalists that they knew helped defeat Hitler, they basically turned a bit of a blind eye to nationalism in the military and in the security services. Mm-hmm. And so it continued to be a strong force there. And after 1990, where the rest of us were focused on economic change, we were watching the oligarchs, the nationalism was growing. Two stories from my early times in Moscow. One is the one you mentioned, in which a member of the Duma said to me, he said, there are forces in Russia, in the military, in the security services in particular, who will never accept an independent Ukraine. This is part of the Russians' identity. And my reaction was, well, they're a little bit late. At that point, it was 16 years of Ukrainian independence. I said, that's well established. That can't be undone. And he said to me, sooner or later, they will try. The other story was that when the Russian journalist Politkovskaya was killed by Chechens for her reporting on Chechnya, I went and saw her editors at Novaya Gazeta, and they made the point to me, and this is going back 15 years, that the real problem was not Putin, but it was the people on the extreme right, people that were a threat to Putin. Now, at that time, Putin had not shown himself as a nationalist. But the period after that, as he stayed in power longer and longer, as he stayed in power without legitimacy, he obviously began to worry about threats to his position. Most dictators do. And what he did two sort of things. One is he turned to his friends in the security service for protection. And the other thing he did, he decided that he didn't want to fight off the far right as he had been doing. And he decided that he would jump in front of them and lead them. Mm-hmm. And this need for security, the people that came in around him, and as he became more and more isolated from the financial people, the economic side, and was worried about his position, he became more and more nationalistic. Clover, in his book, written, as I said, in 2017, says that around 2010, which is about the time I left Moscow, all kinds of commentators who had been kept off the TV, kept off the airwaves, started to appear on Russian television. And over time, the last 12, 13 years now, what has happened is the Russian people have been fed a stronger and stronger diet of nationalist propaganda. And of course, one of the key elements of this, and you commented on this when we were talking earlier, is the fear of the outsider. It's always easier to deal with any domestic problems by saying, look, there's an even bigger exterior threat. And I think that's what has happened, so that a vast percentage of the Russian population have been subjected to propaganda that says, A, the West is about to attack us, that says, B, they are trying to undermine us. And within this, was the element of, well, what about Ukraine? And of course, the Russian nationalists, they should all be united. That is their perception. The Ukrainians not wanting to be united must mean that there's some kind of, those that didn't want, they must be some kind of enemy. And so I think it was easy to convince a lot of people that there was danger in Ukraine. It was a little bit harder, and I think it still is harder, to convince people that there is danger in Ukrainians. And one of the things that struck me in my time in Moscow, especially the second time, was actually how close the people were. Traffic back
the Ukrainians and the Russians.
And the Russians. And I remember, for example, going to a concert in a park on a Sunday afternoon. And there was a Russian singing group, and they were an interesting group. They started off singing classical pieces, and by the end of the concert, they were singing Queen and We Will Overcome. But in the middle of it, they played and sang a Ukrainian pop song that was popular at the time. The whole audience in Moscow, in Russia, they knew that song.
Yeah, uh-huh.
And they sang along. And so to me, that sort of, it was sort of showed a little bit of how close it was. Now, on the other hand, you have a real breakdown in communication. I have some distant relatives in Ukraine that I am in touch with. And I asked them last weekend, I said, are you telling your friends and relatives in Russia what is happening? And my distant cousin wrote back to me. She said, we try, we tell them often, they simply do not believe us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And of course, it's instinctive that people do not want to believe the worst
mm-hmm.
of their countrymen. They are committed to Russia in one degree or another. And it is very hard to believe that these awful things are happening. Mm-hmm. But I think we very much missed how this nationalism was emerging, how Putin, as he became more and more isolated, both because of his insecurity and as he moved towards extreme nationalism, became a stronger and stronger nationalist. Mm-hmm. Then you add into this, and sort of, don't get me going on the Russian church and the mm-hmm. in the role they are playing in basically preaching Russian nationalism, and they have been all along. I called on Patriarch Kirill when he was first appointed and met with him. And I was struck by two things. One, he came across in most conversation as a very westernized figure. The second thing was that the minute you suggested something wasn't quite right in Russia, he became extremely defensive and not almost, but racist in his comments. In our case, what came up in the conversation, because it was current, was that Azerbaijanis have a big control of the goods and a lot of vegetables and fruits in a lot of Russian markets. A lot of it comes from Azerbaijan. And there were racial incidents happening. And I said the church should play a role in bringing an end to these. And he said absolutely not, and just launched into this attack on the Azeris on what their business practices and everything else. And another sort of anecdote, if you like, it was when I visited the monastery where the training of Russian priests take place. We were given a tour by one of the priests there, and he made sort of two comments that again was extremely worrying to me. One was that he said, "Oh, things are much better in Canada than the United States," and I said, "Well, we're very proud of Canada." And he said, "Yeah, but do you know why that is?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Well, you don't have those Black people." And so that very much tainted my view of the church already. And so when I was talking to Kirill, I was sort of maybe sensitive to the racism issue, but he did nothing to dissuade me from that. But that's all, of course, that is a strong part of nationalism.
Azerbaijanis, but a lot of Central Asians. When I was there in the early, before you left, about 2010, and I think right. I was there mostly a little before then. I used to go every year, but I was there. For example, I was there when Putin's reinstallation took place that year. Anyway, there were a lot of people from Central Asia doing jobs like cleaning the streets and so on.
Yeah,
and a tremendous hostility and racism, I would say, toward them on the part of people who would, we would have thought of as being Democrats and liberal progressives.
Yeah.
Yeah. Was that conspicuous to you too?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. But you also saw it in the church and in the in the politicians as well. And I think Putin and the nationalists, and Putin have said that the greatest tragedy is it was the end of the Soviet Union. Well, I don't think Putin gives a damn about communism or even a lot of the countries on the fringe of Russia, but he does care about the Slavic peoples, and he does care about Russia's role in the world, and that is what he is regretting. He certainly doesn't want communism back or anything resembling it, but he wants a world in which Russia remains and is a prominent voice. Obviously, through all this, and from the Cold War, the United States is the focus of it. But I could tell even when I was there that Russia was very worried about China. And
I'd like to trace a transition you just alluded to a little bit ago, where you say there was a transition from his being, Putin's being influenced largely by, I guess, the people in finance and other maybe modern fields, to being influenced by the nationalists in these military institutes and so on. Now, that would not be something I would have followed at all. I had lots and lots of friends who were very high level people. I got extraordinarily good access to people in the Gorbachev government. But after that, I had no contact with people in Yeltsin's government, and certainly nothing with the people under Putin. So that transition is not one that I understand. If you ask me who was a nationalist, the only name I would have come up would be Solzhenitsyn, and he's obviously not the kind of guy you're talking about. So who are these?
Well, some of his views are questionable.
Oh, yeah, but would you say he's militaristic in his?
No, probably not. But when you're the leader of a country, you have to consider the military side of it.
Okay. I don't want to argue about that, but I basically, my own point is, I was not aware of any influential nationalists. But since then, I've heard of some guy named Dugan or
That's
some,
right. Yes.
some people. I've never read a word the man wrote, but um, what? Who are these people that were so influential in these military institutes?
Well, they were a wide range of people who had very strong nationalist views, who came back in 1990s. You know, some of them had been sent to Siberia by the communists. Some of them were otherwise exiled. They came back and they started to teach in these institutes where their words, their views were falling on fertile ground. And the thing was that I think, as Putin began to worry more and more about his security and his safety and his position, as most dictators tend to do, and when he had he has no legitimacy behind him. A bunch of crooked elections don't really provide that much legitimacy. And so he began to turn more and more to them. One of the interesting things is, you know, we've taken sanctions against a lot of the oligarchs.
Mm-hmm.
And the oligarchs are saying, no, we don't have any influence on Putin now.
Mm-hmm.
But they did. 15 years ago, they clearly did.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, they were very much responsible for bringing Putin into power initially to make sure the communists stayed down and that they didn't completely all fall apart after Yeltsin. But their interest and influence has faded over time. And I think Putin's interest in what they brought to the country, and some of them took more than they brought, clearly, but what they brought to the country and what modernization and economic development brought to him was less important to Putin than A, his security, and B, Russia's role in the world.
Yeah, okay, that figures. But I'm not sure who these people are and why the transition occurred. He was given a lot of credit for being really competent because, you know, where the 90s under Yeltsin was just chaos and the economy was in shambles and everything, he did make it start growing and it looked better organized. So I think that the people my impression was that the people who even reluctantly gave him credit for competence did so on those grounds for a long time. Now, when that transition occurred, and in fact, you say he didn't have legitimacy, but he really did have a huge amount of support. You know,
and he still does.
Yeah, more maybe than he did even 5 years ago. I don't know.
But he took people along with him by creating this vision of a imminent threat. I mean, his speech on May 9th, focusing on Ukraine development of nuclear weapons, or of they were planning an attack on Russia from. I mean, that's absurd.
Yeah,
but it's not being laughed out of the room by the Russians. And I think yes, he did. He had the competent thing.
So but why do you say he got nervous about his lack of legitimacy? Why would he have even had any fears whatever? I would have thought, you know, any American president or any Canadian prime minister with the kind of approval ratings that he had would be feeling glorious, you know?
Well, there's the whole issue of the legitimacy of polling in Russia and particularly now. If you get a phone call in Russia and you're a middle level bureaucrat, and somebody asks you, "What do you think of Putin's actions in Ukraine?" Nobody's going to say they disapprove, but there was legitimate progress, no question that legitimate progress, and some people still remember it. But what I read, and I'm terrible on names, so I'm not going to give you many names, but the people closest around Putin, the people he turns to, tend to be almost all from the security services.
There's somebody, they sort of live together or something at a retreat. I read something recently about some guy who's a historian. I guess he's a physicist originally, but he's into some nutty theory of Slavic supremacy or something.
That's right. Yeah. These are the people that are around him, and these are the people he talks to.
Yeah, but there's another kind of appeal, which I guess you could call it nationalism, but it's a kind of resentment that I think goes with anybody who tends to be downwardly mobile, so to speak. That is, people who've lost status we're not talking about class now. I'm not talking about economic conditions. I'm saying in any hierarchy that a Weberian would call a status hierarchy, prestige and dignity and all of that, elitism and so on. That in any hierarchy like that, when a group, they're always there's no objective ranking. It's always comparative, am I higher than you, or you're higher than he is, or so on. And so every time somebody moves up, then somebody else logically has to be downwardly mobile, just because of the way this comparison works. And people who slip in a hierarchy of status get resentment in a way that I can only see in my Russian friends who admire democracy, admire, for example, Justin Trudeau as a great leader and so on, admire and wish that Russia were a democracy, but do not want to acknowledge that there are any problems, or rather, they really resent people whom they also envy for belonging to a society that has higher status on a democracy scale. Okay, that's all I can say, is that I have friends, I've lost friends who are get really mad at me for being I'm an imperialist, I'm a I don't know what. And I'm a haughty person looking down on Russia. And, what do you say to that kind of situation? Now, of course, they're supporting Putin, and everybody seems to be. A lot of people who wouldn't have a year ago are now.
Well, the laws have changed in Russia.
Okay, but I don't know how to handle situations where somebody resents me or resents anybody who is for having gained status in some theoretical hierarchy, if it means that they have comparatively lost status. How do you reassure people? Because even if you try to be generous and egalitarian and that sort of thing, it can be read as a kind of haughtiness or condescension or patronizing attitude. Whatever you do, you can't win.
Well, I understand your dilemma, and I'm afraid I don't know the answer to it. We always say you got to keep talking, but And people are finding that with great frustration now. You even read that, people from Ukraine phoning their mothers in Russia and not being believed about what's happening.
Absolutely.
And it's there's no question that a number of things happened through the 2000 to 2010 that sort of wounded Putin's amour propre.
Mm-hmm.
But that shouldn't be, reason to launch a war. But I think to some degree in this case, it has been among them, because I think finding legitimate reasons
Mm-hmm.
for this war, and as a result, because I think we underestimated the degree of that he was being driven by extreme nationalism, that in all this run-up to the war, the Americans were saying he's launching a war, and we're all saying, I don't think he'll do that. And this goes back to your comment that the perception is that Putin was very competent. I mean, there was nothing competent. There's nothing good for Russia out of launching this war.
No.
And this is a war that, regardless of almost now how it ends, everybody's going to be a loser. And certainly the Ukrainians, they may get Putin out of their country, but and Putin will lose, or Putin will lose still, even if he keeps part of Ukraine and claims a victory, but it's going to be a very Pyrrhic victory. And so they can't win. The security in Europe is completely up in the air now, because you don't know what's going to happen next. What is it going to do to economies as people inevitably take money that could have been used for social programs and put it more and more into the military? There's no winners in this. And for those of us who thought that Putin was too smart to do this, I think we underestimated the nationalism issue.
Well, but there were things that I think the West did that I think were a mistake, and I thought so at the time. This thing about the expansion of NATO, I never thought that should happen. In fact, when the WTO disbanded, I thought NATO should too. Yeah, so I'm a real peacenik in that regard. And I had a conversation with Pavel Palaschenko a while back before this war started, and he was saying, well, this quotation that you hear all the time about Baker reassuring Gorbachev that NATO would not move 1 inch to the east, and Palaschenko said he was interpreter. He was the guy who was interpreted this very statement, and he said that Gorbachev did not expect that and could not have demanded that, or I said he should have gotten in writing, but he said it wasn't really something that anybody could have taken as a binding commitment. I don't know, and I don't even know how seriously Americans felt about that promise. And less do I have any idea, which you may know, whether the Canadian government also had the view that NATO should not admit former Soviet states to the membership.
Well, I feel very strongly that there are two different issues here. One is the former countries of the Warsaw Pact and the Baltic states. These are countries that for 40 years were subjugated by Russia. by force, had the communism, the state forced on them. And we had no right to say to them, you must live in limbo forever. I think that we did that. And
by the way, I wouldn't disagree with you on that one.
Yeah, and we sort of lived up to that. We took them into NATO. I think we have done Ukraine some disservice, however, in that we started talking about Ukraine into NATO back in 2008. Canada was one of the loudest voices on that, and Stephen Harper had a piece in the paper over the weekend in which he attacks NATO for not moving fast enough to bring Ukraine in. But at that point, when we first started talking about them, Ukraine, to the extent the polling was being done in Ukraine, showed that only 5% of Ukrainians wanted to join NATO. Yushchenko was the president. He had only 15% of the support. We knew he was going to be defeated. And I thought that made absolutely no sense to be inviting them into NATO when A, they at that point, they didn't want to come, and B, we weren't really going to take them in. And now their view on joining NATO has of course changed. After getting rid of Yanukovych and seeing the Russian reaction to that and the losing Crimea, Ukrainian opinion changed very radically. Ukrainians want to be in NATO. But the West has never been on the verge of taking them into NATO. And to me, I think that's sort of been outrageous to be preaching we're taking them in when we clearly it wasn't going to happen. The only person that seems to believe that it was going to happen were some Ukrainians and Putin. And you can even see that even now, where, excuse me, people are starting to talk about, well, maybe NATO's not on, but we'll take Ukraine into EU. You know, the French president on the weekend said that's not going to happen anytime soon.
I was surprised because I would have thought it'd be a lot easier for people to let them into EU than NATO, and that, you know, you could do one but not the other. But it sounds like that's not.
Well, there's all kinds of issues that relate to corruption and all kinds of other things that have to be dealt with. But the point is that I think what we have been guilty of is suggesting to the Ukrainians we would protect them. And our protection has been less than it should have been. On the other hand, if you had asked me 2 months ago, how much protection would we offer Ukraine, I would have thought it would be less than we actually have done. I think in terms, there's been much more solidarity on the economic sanctions front. There's been much more solidarity in sending weapons to Ukraine. There's a headline in one of the papers today that says, how long can we keep that up? And that is a good question.
Well, it is, even especially with the influx of refugees, which just seems to continue. There are 5-something million now. How many people can? And by the way, I heard that Canada was going to take 100,000, but I haven't heard of a single one getting here.
There are people here, and Newfoundland did a very interesting thing. They sent their people into Warsaw and have recruited a plane full of Ukrainians who actually want to come and settle. Because the current refugees, you have to realize that some of them, or the vast majority of them, are temporary. They will go back.
Uh-huh.
They hope to go back. Those that want, and those have no interest in coming to Canada. It's too far. But they've left family behind. They want to go back. Those that want to immigrate completely, that number will increase. But I thought Newfoundland did an excellent job in sending their people there and recruiting people to meet their own needs. And I think other provinces should do that.
Mm-hmm. Well, good luck, because, I think Canada's not been a stellar performance in bringing Afghan refugees. So I just hope
But they're actually going back to the two different kinds. It's a different situation. The Afghan ones are all coming permanently. Right now, when we're saying Ukrainians can come, we're saying, okay, come, and then we'll look at this in 3 years for some of them. And they'll give us time to see just who we are importing. It's a little bit different situation, and it's comparing apples and oranges.
Well, also the fact that the Europeans have been so welcoming, that is written up as a proof of racism. They don't take the Syrians in the way they do, or people from Afghanistan.
Yeah, but that was again very interesting. A lot of those Syrians who came to the border, who were students and Africans. First of all, Ukrainian men weren't being allowed out at all. Mm-hmm. And these guys were. Second, when many of them, when asked, well, we'll help you go home, their answer was, no, we don't want to go home. We want to stay in Europe. And whereas the Ukrainians are saying, I want to go back to my husband and family as soon as I can. You have to take into account the differences. Now, I understand why a lot of the students in Ukraine don't want to go back to where they came from, but I think they have to expect that they're welcome at the border. Their processes, if nothing else, at the border will be different than that somebody's that's just coming to avoid the bullets.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's a reasonable argument. Let's go back to the olden days, the end of the Soviet Union, and what could have happened instead. Because I've always been I adore Gorbachev. I mean, I think he made a lot of mistakes, but boy, he was really doing the right things in general. And I had when I had so many Ukrainian visitors who would come and stay with me, even in one case 2 years, and he brought his friends and relatives and girlfriend and everybody. And that I visited his family in Ukraine and so on. So I had a lot of contact, for a while, more contacts with Ukrainians than I did with Russians. And they were always talking about the breakup of whether or not to favor independence for Ukraine. And they were in favor of it. And I was not. And as a matter of fact, looking back on that period, the West is always being blamed by Russians for the breakup of the Soviet Union. It was, in fact, the only people I knew in the West, including I think the Bush administration, said they would have done anything to help Gorbachev hold it together if they could have, but they couldn't because the people wanted to break it up. And my feeling at the time was, if Gorbachev had been able to have this new union treaty, and they had the seats all set up for the meeting, which were going to happen a day or two later, to sign the damn thing. And if they'd had that put through, it would have been a fine regime, and it would have been more federal. It would have given some more local autonomy, but it would have been a Soviet type, conglomerate. And it would have been, we'd be home free, because the democratization that was going on in that period was much more promising than anything that followed, even though Yeltsin was seen as a great Democrat and much more democratic than Gorbachev himself. So at the time, I was saying, look, you guys should be paying more attention to improving the quality of your governance rather than the autonomy of your country. But everybody abandoned Gorbachev. All the progressive people who'd been, in favor of democracy, within a short period of time, they all went over to wanting something different and more radical, and they supported Yeltsin. Okay, I've given you my pitch. Now, what's your point of view at that time?
Well, it wasn't really ours to decide, was it? And
unfortunately,
yeah, and the Russians made their decisions one way or another. Yeltsin had his ambitions. He was supported by the Belarusian and the Ukrainians, and they, Soviet Union disappeared and Russia became prominent. And maybe if Gorbachev had his all-union meeting, but who says it would not have been undermined by somebody or something else shortly down the road? And you already had the situation where a bunch of the old hardliners in the military tried a coup against Gorbachev as well. And so it was far from a secure operation, and I guess what ifs. I guess we're not going to see this.
Maybe you had a point of view at the time.
Oh, at the time, well, first of all, the breakup of the Warsaw Pact and the independence of the other countries were very, very much in favor of. I was very much in favor of it, and including independence of Ukraine. I mean, I was at NATO at the time. One of the things I organized was and we did this in groups of three, of having representatives from the various Warsaw Pact countries come and spend a week with the Canadian delegation to NATO to see how NATO worked and operated, because NATO is a somewhat more democratic organization than a lot of other outside people give it credit for. And so no, I was very much in favor of the independence for Ukraine. I'm a Ukrainian. Certainly the breakup of the Warsaw Pact. And Canada contributed to it in a sort of very much, in a very direct way with the Open Skies initiative, and in which the East European delegations, particularly led at that time by Hungary, but also Poland was very active, were for the first time able to go into an international conference, as they did here in Ottawa, and say, no, that is the Russian position. That's not our position. And of course, that was welcomed very much by the rest of the people. And that same conference, on the margins of it, the Germans were able to set up an arrangement for the reunification of Germany. So we played our role in it. And later, there was debates within the Canadian government about, do we really take these countries into NATO? There were people in the Canadian government that were opposed, but the Prime Minister, Jean Chrétien, there was no question in his mind that it was the right thing to do.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, okay. We were talking about it as if Putin's decision to go to war is totally crazy. And I think 99% is, delusory. But I do think that there are things that could have been done that would have made things a lot better. And the West made some mistakes. I think, for example, when Gorbachev went to ask for help he wanted financial aid, and he got turned down. That would have made a difference. So probably a thing wouldn't have fallen apart if he'd gotten the aid. And there are a number of places, and again, I think the expansion of NATO has been generally a mistake, not just, especially not the Baltic countries, but I think they have a case. It should have been. I would have thought, Ukraine, if they committed to neutrality from the get-go, it would have been a lot better.
They didn't want that.
I know.
They did not want that, and you can say what if, and none of that, none of it threatened Russia in the way that Gorbachev claims, and Gorbachev that Putin claims.
Putin claims, yeah. Okay. Oh, well, I agree, but it wasn't real. I mean, I don't think NATO has, even though they have the weapons to attack, they haven't expressed any intention of doing so. But so I think it's mostly sort of delusory on his side. But there are plenty of people, and I would say among peace activists, maybe more than the people that you hang out with, former diplomats and government officials and so on. Peace activists, many of them are saying, it's really the U.S.'s fault because the expansion of NATO and other aggressive acts, breaking, not working on the treaties, disarmament, further disarmament treaties, and so on. So I don't know. It seems to me, I'll give them credit. I'll say they have a few points, but I don't think the points add up to enough to even begin to explain or least of all justify the kind of aggression that they have undertaken.
There are occasions for which I agree. Putin could feel justifiably offended, but those aren't causes of war.
Right. Mm-hmm. Okay, now the thing I'm doing, I have a little game I'm playing with some of my friends where I'm trying to collect ideas for a new world order. Everybody's saying, well, now this war is changing everything because it's revealing the extent to which bullies really have the freedom to go ahead and toss nuclear weapons around, which I think still might happen. So we have to have a new world order. The UN is unable to prevent this. Some of the UN officials recently said, if you can't do better than this, you ought to just shut up shop and go home. You're not working, you're not doing anything. And the UN isn't very effective. So I'm thinking in terms of what kind of institutional changes should be adopted, maybe as a package, or at least let's put some things in a bag together and see what we can come up with that would create a more secure world order in terms of the kinds of problems that we're facing with the war, but also the capacity to deal with some of the other global problems that are not being addressed properly, such as global warming or preparedness for pandemics and cyber war, and the control of the internet and the disinformation campaigns and all these other catastrophes in waiting that we are not paying attention to because we're so fixated on this war. What would if you were writing a new world order, what would you put in your new constitution for world governance?
I have no idea. I would not presume to try and write a new world order.
Excuse me.
There is. It is a big problem. You've identified some of the scope of it, and add the world poverty, add all kinds of things to it. But one of the things that is very clear right now, and Putin is one manifestation of it, but there are other manifestations of it around the world, is that large segments of populations really are not interested even in multilateral cooperation, let alone a new world order. And, we've been talking about extreme nationalism in Russia, but there's elements in lots of other places. And
Trump could be reelected.
Yes, yeah. And I am not terribly optimistic at this time, and I hope that the young diplomats that came up behind me, some of whom worked for me and I trained, are up to the task, because there is a big job to be done. But I have no formulas.
Well, I think it is true that that it's much more than creating new institutions, although those are essential too. But that you've pointed to the reality that the popular mentality around the world is now populist and nationalistic and sort of right wing, which I think to me, the greatest puzzle of all is why at this moment in history we're seeing that kind of anti-democratic mentality, and what in the world could be done about it. And
well, you mentioned, you referred to it earlier when you talked about people reacting to loss of power and status. And, I think people feel powerless. They feel things are happening to their world that they simply do not agree with. And
but why now? I mean, there's nothing special going on in Brazil or the Philippines that would explain a loss of such a gross loss of status in the world that would explain a resentment and a return to the good old days.
But the resentment doesn't have to be loss of status in the world. It can be loss of status in your own community, and resentment is resentment. It's and people feed off each other's resentments, even though they may be resentful of very different things. And of course, social media helps that too.
Yeah, that's true. The bubbles that we live in our social platforms is apparently making us pretty isolated and narrow-minded. This has been so much fun and interesting. It's never exactly fun, but it's enjoyable, even if it's not.
I've had fun.
Not fun, but I've enjoyed it very much. And It's great to be back in touch with you, Ralph. And certainly, I wish you were back in harness. All right.
I don't.
You don't? Okay.
No. As I said, the young fellows, the young women, young fellows that I trained, some very good people there. Mm-hmm. And I've got grandchildren.
Okay. Thank you so much, and have a great day. Bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Project Save the World produces one of these shows 3 days a week, sometimes more. This is episode 449. You can watch them or listen to them as audio podcasts on our website, tosavetheworld.ca. Eventually, we even post the transcripts there. When you get to that website, look around. We have conversations going on there all the time about 6 global issues, plus potential reforms in governance, economics, and civil society. To find a particular talk show, enter its title or episode number in the search bar, or the name of one of the guest speakers. After you've watched or listened, scroll down and share your thoughts about the show with the other viewers. This is a place for dialogue, so please join in. Project Save the World also produces a quarterly online publication, Peace Magazine. You can buy a single copy or subscribe for the year for $20 Canadian per year through Press Reader. Just go to pressreader.com on your browser, and in the search bar, enter the word peace. You'll see the cover of the current issue and buttons to click to subscribe.